So welcome everybody to our webinar for today, where our topic is From Beginner to Pro, Mastering the Art of Commercial Property Investment. My name's Tim Graham of hotspotting.com.au, and I'm joined by Steve Palise of Palise Property. Steve, it's a second time we've had you on in a matter of a couple of months, but it was a topic that really resonated with people. It's something at Hotspotting we've been known as residential property, but there's so many similarities in our research to where to buy in commercial. So it's a topic that, as I say, a lot of people have really enjoyed. So I'm glad you could make it back again today.
No, it's good. I had a good chat with Terry about that as well on one of our podcasts of basically how the residential market affects the commercial, because they're intertwined. You don't have a residential market without a commercial market. Like you look at a warehouse, you will always need car mechanics, wholesalers, distributors, fabricators, storage. Then you need to service that area. So you have the medical centers, the hairdressers, the physios, the nail salons. So it's all intertwined, and they normally happen in slightly different cycles, but the growth of residential actually affects the growth of commercial as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's start with the basics. What is commercial property? What do we think of when we think commercial versus residential real estate?
Right. So a commercial property can be a residential property. So the only difference is it's a property where the tenant is purely there for money-making purposes. So they're looking at making revenue. So an example I always use is you can still have a GP clinic in a residential house. That becomes a commercial property. So zone commercial, they're there to make money. Then you can have a mix. You could have like a retail shop with a residential on top. Then it goes all the way through the other ones of office space, industrial, retail, special as well. So specials, things like single purpose stuff like petrol stations, cinemas, car wash stations, things like that. Even residential apartment blocks, after 3 or 4 banks consider them a commercial purchase for the loans as well. Then you got things like greenfield, where you can talk farms and land and things like that. But for most investors, it's retail, office, industrial. They're the 3 that most people think of.
Okay. So key distinction really is that the tenant is there to make money, and therefore, and they're also paying a lot of the outgoings on the property as well.
Yeah, case by case, but I'd say 90% of the time, this is the main difference with commercial. When you talk yields, you're talking net yields. So when I say a 6% net yield, that's not comparable to a 6% residential yield, because you've still got council rates, water rates, maintenance, insurances, things like that. Commercial, tenant looks after all of it. They look after your maintenance and council rates and water rates. So it's a difference. So where like a 5-6% gross yield might end up being a 3.5%. Commercials typically 2 to 3 times the cash flow, because it's a net yield.
Yeah. Now, I suppose from a finance perspective, for a long time, commercial loans were at a much higher interest rate than a residential, but they're, with the higher interest rate environment we're in right now, there's probably only a 1% difference. Would that be right?
Barely. So
Barely?
most of the time, I'm seeing some like 6.5s at the moment for commercial. So it's really tight. Banks are getting a bit more of an appetite for commercial now, because it's becoming a bit more well-known. Different lenders, obviously different cases and different types of assets will have things, but general rule of thumb, 0.5% to 1% more. But you got to take into account you're getting 2 to 3 times more rent as well. So in regards to the factor that it changes the outcome, it's quite small in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. And obviously in a high interest rate environment, one of the most popular reports that we've been selling at Hotspotting is the positive cash flow report. So looking at locations that have got higher rental yields, commercial definitely falls into that sort of category as well, because of that net yield being much higher.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I always come across. People say don't buy commercial because it's high risk, and they're normally referring to like long periods of vacancy for that. But I can also argue that, assuming you don't buy an area with big long vacancies, isn't it lower risk having a property that's positively geared in a high interest rate environment? Whereas if you'd buy a very stereotypical Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide property, let's say, I don't know, 800, 900,000, that costs you 10, 15 grand a year to hold, isn't getting a property that's 5 or 10 grand a year positive way lower risk, because you can actually hold the property and weather the storms. So it just depends how you look at it. And then you also look at like vacancies over a long term. Like you might have 6 months vacancy over a 10-year period because you get longer leases. When you work that out over the 10 years, it's actually not that different. Obviously, residential is a bit tighter, but like I said, 2 to 3 times the cash flow, so you can make it up there.
Well, that's the thing. I think at the moment, a lot of investors in the residential space have, they're hitting their cap on borrowing. So I think being able to throw a commercial property into the mix is probably going to be seen quite favorably from a lender's perspective.
It also doesn't have the same glass ceiling that residential has. So where most people run into servicing issues with residential, because as you know, like the banks do shading. So they add on like 1.5 to 3% kind of extra interest rate, take 80% of the rent, do P&I. When you do that to an already negatively geared property, it becomes very negatively geared in their eyes. Whereas you do it to a positively geared property, it doesn't hurt as much. So it doesn't add to your servicing, but it doesn't take away as much. But what a lot of people don't know is there's different types of loans with commercial. So you've got things like lease stock loans where they give it to you based on the strength of the lease itself. So you can keep pushing the envelope a bit further with commercial where most people hit the glass ceiling with residential.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, you're talking about some of the myths already. What do you find the biggest misconceptions around commercial property in your experience?
So I sort of alluded to before about vacancy rates. Everyone always compares it to like, oh, I saw my local corner shop sit there for 2 or 3 years vacant. Look, don't go out and buy your corner shop that's vacant. Like buy something that's lower risk. It's the same as like, there's lots of real high risk residential at markets, lots of mining towns and really regional areas, even types of residential. Like you can go buy a high density off the plan apartment. Yeah. Of course, that's higher risk than like a freestanding house. Same as like office at the moment, vacancy rates, capital cities are normally 15 to about 18% Australia-wide. Industrial, because it's a land component, we're talking about 0.6, 0.7%. So even though a lot of residential areas like 0.3%, we're getting on paper, like I read your reports, like a few years ago, anything under 2% was a really attractive vacancy rate. Yeah. Now
that's Australia-wide.
Now industrial, you're there as well. So like I said, like most of the stuff we're buying, you're talking 1 to 3 months vacancy for an industrial warehouse. But again, different types, different vacancy rates. Office, really high risk at the moment, but high yield at the moment as well. Retail, it's very hard to get the data behind it because it's very much like, unless you're buying like a Westfield shopping center, that's where most of the data analyst sites look at, like the CBREs and the Savills and the Knight Franks. They're all looking at the big stuff. Yeah. Unless you're that type of investor, you're not going to go out and buy Westfields. You're going to buy a local cafe or medical center or things like that. So that's all got to do with foot traffic, road traffic, demand of the area. So that one's a bit harder to analyze, but you can still do quite well. Funnily enough, I spoke to Terry about this on the last podcast. Regional areas typically have tighter retail vacancy rates, surprisingly, in certain areas. So you go to like the main strip of a major regional town, that's tightly held because everyone goes up and down that main street. But the one street back, the factor fault goes by about 10 in terms of vacancy.
Makes sense.
There's no foot traffic. So you always got to analyze what you've got, the versatility, the vacancy there. So that's people's biggest concern. But if you're really low risk, you can go out and buy an industrial property and basically have pretty much the same risk as a residential. I showed you this one of my personal purchases before this call, Tim. I bought a shopping center for 3 mil. It's got 8 tenants, all on 3 to 7 year leases. So even if I lose one of the tenants, I'm effectively still getting 7/8 of the rent. So I can kind of weather the storm that way. So there's lots of different types you can mitigate that risk. So I'd say that's the biggest myth. The one I constantly hear, and I'm still surprised I hear it, people say that they don't grow the same. You say you don't get the same capital growth out of commercial. That's just completely wrong. Like it came from historically where it came in different cycles.
Well, it's the same as they've been saying for a long time that apartments don't grow. And, we've seen over the last 10 years now that in a lot of markets, the 10-year average is actually higher in a lot of unit markets than it is in the same location for houses.
Yeah, because
it's this paradigm that's got to change.
Yeah, it's always case by case because affordability typically always wins as well. But the thing I always say to people to prove them wrong is you normally ask them, okay, is a commercial property more expensive than a residential? And most people say yes. And then I facetiously say, well, how did it get more expensive? And then they're like, well, if Resi was growing 2% more per year over 30 years, shouldn't it be more expensive? On average, you get for certain types of assets, like normally 5 to 6.5% capital growth, depending on what and where you buy. It's impossible for you to not like, you're not, let's use it as dramatized. Let's say you've got, I don't know, $500,000 house sitting next to a $500,000 warehouse 20 years ago. The $500,000 house doesn't go to $1 million. And then all the people in the $1 million houses looking at the warehouse being like, well, that rents for 3 times as much. Why don't I just buy that? And that's what actually happens sometimes. The cycles move because like they see the affordability. So on average, they're always going to be on par. But like residential, you got to look at oversupply, where you're buying, what you're buying, how tightly held the market is, what the residential market's doing. So i.e. population growth, what infrastructure is going in, because that's the big driver for that as well.
Yeah, well, that was where I was going to go next. We have a bit of a formula for selecting areas. We're very big on long-term growth. Yes, we were looking for markets that are moving quickly as well, so we can ride some uplift in the early years. But typically, we do take a long-term view on real estate. And we have a formula where we're sort of looking at, the local economy first and foremost, what's strong and diverse local economy, minimum market size, population growth, things like that. Do you have the same sort of formula for commercial?
Yeah, and we use a lot of your data as well, which is quite nice.
That's nice to hear.
But one of the things I love about hotspotting is, I don't going to probably use the wrong word here, but you don't care what's happened historically, because that has nothing to do.
That's exactly right.
You're not buying the property 20 years ago. You've missed that. So you're always focusing on the next 10, 15 years. And that's where you look at like the population growth and the infrastructure spending. So we definitely do look at that. One of the things I like about commercial is you can also mitigate risk by just forecasting what the residential market can do, as well as assuming you buy in a well encapsulated area. So what I mean by that is, say I buy a little industrial property and it's in an industrial complex and it's completely surrounded by residential. The first thing I do is I check what's going on in that residential area. So you look at what infrastructure is going in. If they're not building any more industrial, and then you can see zoning changes and lots of developments where they're turning low density into medium or high density, how is that property in 20 years' time going to be in less demand than it is now? Because there's more people. They've got to service more areas. And obviously there's exceptions to rules. But that doesn't guarantee capital growth, but it can guarantee that the property is going to be in more demand, which hopefully translates to capital growth.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. On the topic that you just mentioned about historically not being too worried about what's happened, we often say the past doesn't predict the future, and we're always looking at what's coming into the area, and that's what we should be focusing on. And if people take a historical view on a lot of real estate markets and real estate assets, they can miss big opportunities. And areas like the Sunshine Coast in Queensland are a perfect example of that, both with residential and commercial. Historically, it's just been very, very poor up until about 2017, 2018, where it absolutely took off. But if you personally only looked at what the historic data has done, you would never have bought that.
Yeah. And the other thing is Australia is so young. So I started my business when I was in the UK, and like I actually own a property over there that's 300 years old. Like when you think about that and you think about Australia,
you only got a 99-year lease, no doubt.
Yes, right. Well, they actually do. They don't don't get me started on their system with like their leaseholds and their kind of chain systems and stuff like that. But Australia is so young when you think about it. And one of my bit of a pet peeve I have with a lot of like industry experts is they'll say like, buy inner ring Sydney because historically it's had the best growth. But when they're talking about historically, like you go back to the 70s, the population was like 2.2 mil. So the population of Western Sydney now is 2 mil. So why aren't they saying buy inner ring Western Sydney? Like they're not comparing apples and apples. And that's why hotspotting, you look at what's coming up. So if Western Sydney looks like it's got more infrastructure and room for growth and lack of supply, why would you not buy there? So it's one of those ones. But that's what I love about hotspotting is you guys are future focused, not historically focused.
Yeah. The next thing I was going to say, Steve, if we were looking at, well, actually, let's start with the lack of supply here in Australia. So the number one issue facing residential is a lack of supply. Are you seeing the same things in the areas that you're buying commercial real estate? Is that what's driving a lot of the capital growth?
Yep, exactly right. So like I mentioned, especially for like industrial, COVID also gave retail a little bit of a kick up the bum as well, because obviously that shifted a lot of the like CBD type retail into suburban retail. But industrial, if you'd asked me 4 years ago, I was talking about 7% vacancy rates, and I was saying anything less than 5% is a tightly held area. Now pretty much everything I buy is sub 1% vacancy rate. So that's a good indicator for growth, because obviously if there's no stock and people need to rent the space, that's going to push up prices. The other thing we've really seen the last 3 years, especially for industrial, rental increases have been huge. So we've typically seen between 10 and 15% year on year with commercial. And as you know, Tim, like commercial is typically valued on the yield that it generates. So if you get a 15% rental increases, it typically translates to 15% capital growth. So that's that's not changing anytime soon. I went to the Sunshine Coast Town Hall meeting for commercial. When was this? 2022. They had run out of stock for industrial that was supposed to last until 2030.
Yeah, I
So
believe
because
that.
that Sunshine Coast is boomed,
Mm.
they ran out of stock. So now they're scrambling to kind of build. So that's only going to get tighter and tighter and tighter. And this is part of commercial of, when you talk about like investor locations and owner occupied locations, in the past, you could normally kind of buy owner occupied type vacant warehouse cheaper. In some areas, they actually go for more money now. So sellers are actually looking at, because so many businesses want that area so much.
Yeah.
For examples, I live on the northern beaches of Sydney. Vacancy rates around like Brookvale area are pretty much zero. There's more people willing to buy than there is rent, and the rent is already, there's a 0% vacancy rate. So that should translate to some capital growth. The negative of that is the yields are quite poor. You're talking like 4.5%. And then you start weighing up, okay, do I go buy a Sunshine Coast one where I get 6% versus a 4.5%? And that's probably a conundrum of commercial. There's no definition of what a good quality property is, because some people love yield. So they're purely buying for cash flow. Some people want capital growth.
It depends where you are in your journey as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I always use this on my calls. I always say, comes down to what you're trying to achieve over what time frame versus what finances you've got to work with.
Yeah.
So like if you're a 63-year-old, going out and buying a negatively geared residential property doesn't really help you for retirement. So you have to talk cash flow. So that could be like house and granny flat strategy. It could be more regional town with a better yield, or at the top of the food chain commercial. If you're really young, inversely, it's all about leverage. That's the advantage of property, is leveraging as much money as you can. Like, I don't really care about property itself. I care about the vehicle that gets me to where I want. So cool, go out and get the 90% loans with lenders, mortgage insurance, have the bank of mum and dad to fall back on if you need, and you'll actually do better because you'll get 2 or 3 times the amount of properties. So if you get the same capital growth, you get more options down the track. So like you said, it's just coming up with a kind of tailored plan for what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Listen, on the subject of, the LVRs, like the loans, I've always thought there's a really close connection between the loan to value ratio that the banks will offer you on a any type of asset and risk. Obviously banks are giving 95% loans on residential property, which would say quite low risk. At the moment, we're sort of seeing maybe 70%, possibly 80% on commercial. So that does mean that the banks sort of see that there's a bit more risk there. What do you think are the main risks involved in commercial property, and how do you mitigate them?
Yeah, so you touched on that. So the LVRs are getting tighter. So there's actually about 4 or 5 lenders doing 80%, which is quite strong, because that's where most
on particular types of commercial, no doubt.
On typical, they've still got risk profiles. The same as for residential, there's certain postcode restrictions. You can't go and buy in really regional mining towns. It's just, sometimes it's state-based. They're normally balancing their books, or it's asset type. So for instance, if it's like a special one, like I mentioned before, like a one-dimensional type, like petrol station or a cinema or a dog wash or whatever it is, they'll have a lower LVR for that. But typically like suburban retail and industrial, you can get 80%. Office, some lenders actually love it. They've got a really good appetite for it, and they actually give an 80% as well, and others 70%. So this is probably the harder job when you're talking to a mortgage broker, is make sure you're talking to a well-versed commercial mortgage broker, because there's a few options there. Some of the new products, there's 100% LVRs you can get as business owners. So that's not even available for most of residential. So they are coming to play with that. But I think your question was, what are the main risks?
Yep.
So how long do we have? We've got 30. This is probably the hardest thing with commercial is residential. You can typically, as long as you don't do something silly, as long as you buy like tight vacancy rates, good population growth, there's short days on market, there's a good demand for the property. Don't do anything silly like buy a termite riddled house or flood zone or whatever it may be. You'll generally be okay long term. Whereas commercial, you've got to do all that analysis plus way more. You've got to do lease review, contract review, tenant interviews, foot and road traffic analysis, vacancy study, occupancy studies, credit history checks on the tenant, check the leases are registered, look at value add opportunities, check all the approvals, check their insurances. There's so many more moving parts to it that you can stuff up. So,
and then the big part I always say as well is exit strategy. When I want to sell my house, I could potentially have hundreds of interested parties. On a commercial, that's going to be a lot less.
There is a lot less, but there's also less stock as well.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
Yes, you're right in that regard, but in regards to stock, we're at all-time lows anyway. But generally current days on market I'm seeing are generally 30 to 50 days. So it's still quite strong, but most people don't buy real estate to be able to flick it off within 2 or 3 weeks.
Yes,
And
of course.
anyone who was buying residential with that mindset, I'd say 5 years ago, like, yes, it's nice now, but it wasn't as attractive kind of back then.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't be buying commercial with a short-term mindset anyway. You're either
Yeah.
buying for cash flow or value-add opportunities, and then
Mhm.
you're keeping it from there.
Yeah.
But with the due diligence, this is where the risk comes from. And to be honest, where the risk from the banks come from, because they know people stuff up. Like, I've went to buy properties and I send them my due diligence checklist and say, oh, agent, can you give me all this? And they're kind of like, no, I've got buyers who will buy it without doing all that. You're kind of like, well, I'm not going to buy it for my client unless we do this information.
Yeah.
So there's way more thing. It's not hard. There's just more steps involved. It's like climbing a staircase. Like, it's just a lot more steps you can kind of trip up on. But assuming you've got the knowledge and the information, this is why I've got books and checklists and a course and things like that. You can mitigate it. And then, like I keep mentioning, you get 3 times more rent. So if you're trying to generally build a passive income, so I hear all the spruikers saying, oh, get residential, 100K passive income in 10, 15 years. You run the numbers. It's very, very hard to do. You need 5 to 10 mil portfolios to kind of get there. But you can buy a commercial on, like, let's say $1 million property on a 6% net yield and actually achievably pay that off in 10 to 15 years. So 6% net yield, 60 grand rent. So you're getting most of the way there without even rental increases. Typically in that 10 to 15 years, the rents will double. So you 120K. So you're doing it with a lot smaller portfolio as well. And that's what we talked about with risk with commercial. Yes, there's riskier in regards to if you lose your tenant, you've got a big debt with no income. That's very hard. And that's part of your buffers that you have in place. But you can actually get to a passive income goal way, way quicker than residential. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. Like I said, there's external factors with interest rates and tax and things like that. But just generally, like, you can get there literally 10 to 15 years, you can build a passive income, which I've obviously done and we've done some clients.
Yeah. Well, look, so you've got certainly got a reputation in the commercial space, but we know you obviously sell residential and commercial. I think you probably got the big name in commercial name because you do it very well, and there's not as many buyers agents out there in the commercial space. But what I'm interested to know is let's put you on the spot and say a couple of case studies. We often hear about huge growth in residential and good rental yields and things like that from a lot of our guests on this podcast. I'd love to do the same with you. So could you rattle off a couple of case studies from either recent ones or a couple of years old? Talk about the where the customer was at, what problems were they trying to achieve, and then how commercial helped them.
Yep. Okay. So the typical one, I'll stick with the simple one for now. So, like, the typical one is mum and dad investor with 2 or 3 residential properties. And they're looking to build a passive income. Typically, the number's always rounded. People always choose a rounded number. They go 50K, 100K, or 200K. Which I'll always correct. Whenever someone says a 200K passive income, I'll actually come back and say, why do you want a 200K passive income? And they're like, oh, well, I want to travel. And I'm like, you don't need 200K to travel. Like, do you want to travel instead of doing it in 20 years time? Do you want to do it in 10 years time and we'll get there a bit quicker? So that's the typical one I get. 3 or 4 properties, getting the servicing limits, want to buy $500 to $2 million kind of commercial property. And like I said, one of those numbers. So for that scenario, I'd go very low risk. Like I said, industrial warehouse, good tenant, long lease, low vacancy rate region, versatile premises and things like that. So I've got a lot of cases. I've done 1,500 properties now, but that's the typical one. Then we get some people that are really aggressive. So they want to accumulate really quick and shoot for the stars and get 200, 300, 400. That's where we have to do value add opportunities. So that's where you kind of buy something below market, put mezzanine floors on. And that's actually probably something worth talking about now as well. Value add opportunities with commercial. People will say you can't really do anything with a commercial. You can still do everything that you do with a residential. You can still renovate, you can still subdivide, you can still, what you've got with commercial is all that plus more. Like, even adding solar panels to your warehouse or retail property, that increases your cash flow, which increases the value of the property. It doesn't increase the value of a residential property typically. Might make it a bit more attractive for a buyer, but no one pays an extra 100, 200 grand because there's some solar panels. Then you've got multiple use. So you can split tenancies up. You can put mezzanine floors. You can do off-peak renting. So like some like warehouses will do like nighttime, they do their jiu-jitsu gym, and during the day it operates as something else. So you've got all those ones. Then you got mixed tenancies. So there's actually a lot more you can kind of do with commercial that way. But in regards to, I'll choose another case study. Okay, so a year ago, I had a client that basically wanted a really big passive income. So we had to find something high yielding. We bought a freestanding building in Perth that had 4 tenants. So it actually had, I think it's like an escape room, an office, a boxing gym, and I think it was a dentist on the other side.
Yep.
Freestanding in Perth. What we were going to do is we actually knew that was in a zone where we could put telecommunications towers on top. So we went unconditional subject to due diligence, and he got paid $1 million for a 10-year lease. Yeah, so the property was about 3.2 mil, and he got given $1 million for a lease. There are some negatives to that besides the big cash injection is you're not allowed to sell the property and things like that. Like there's certain kind of rules and paybacks and things like that.
Yeah.
But that got him to his goal. He got the $1 million as cash up front, put it into another property and won again. So there's all those little ones. But again, they're similar to being like a developer in residential. There's more effort. It's not as passive. We were talking before about my strategy before this call was I'm actually, because I'm busy in my business and life and I travel a lot, I actually buy really passive investments. I buy a very boring, tick the box.
I'm the same in residential. I never spend anything.
I've got enough stress with like baby travel and business and that type of stuff. I just want my nest egg. And that also comes down to I'm not shooting for the stars. I don't want to be one of those billionaire buyer's agents. Having a few $100,000 passive income so I can keep traveling and keep working like only 4 or 5 hours a day. Like that's my personal goal. So that's sort of touching on what you mentioned before about align it with your goals. And then that's how you'll actually get to where you want to be.
Yeah. Love it. Well, I don't want to steal too much content from a future podcast that I know you're going to do, but something you said to me on before the call was that you can learn a lot from the success, but I also love to know about the ones that you don't proceed with. When you go through and you do the due diligence and you say, you know what, we're not going to proceed with this one. What are the reasons why?
Yeah, so we actually crashed on about 28 properties last year, which is about 1 in 5. Like it's not a short amount. Walking away from a property is obviously the best thing you can do. And like you sometimes get clients that are like, oh, but I've already put some money into a building and pest and some lawyers and evaluations.
That's just an insurance policy you're building in pest.
It is. But if I'm telling a client, hey, I don't want to get paid a commission right now, I can do better. Like that's a pretty honorable thing. It's like, I know I want a good outcome. Because that's how you get them back for number 2, number 3, and they recommend their friends and you become affiliates with hotspotting because you're legitimate at what you do. Yeah. But the typical ones are just basically the numbers don't match up with what the agent gave you. So when you're checking rental ledgers and cross-checking all that, normally we can salvage those deals though. So as long as it's a good agent you're working with, you'll go back and renegotiate the purchase price based on what the yield you were negotiating on in the first place. So you can try to achieve that. Other ones that we found from recently is like we've had 3 in the last few months where they had fire cladding, or what do you call it? So basically, it didn't have combustible cladding, so couldn't get insurance. Banks didn't like it, crashed the deal. That was an easy kind of one. Where it gets hard is where you find something that you're not that comfortable with, but you kind of it's a good buy in a hot market. So a very stereotypical one, I'd probably say about 1 in 5 of those, 1 in 5 that we crash. It's unimproved structures. So that's where like you buy a warehouse and there's a mezzanine floor and it's not approved. What the banks and valuers do is they don't take that floor space into account for the rent. So even though you're getting the rent, if it's 30% of the floor space, they're reducing your rent by 30%, which typically means the valuation will be 30% less. But I'd say one of the advantages of using a buyer's agent is we know what to do in those situations. So normally I'll go back and I'll offer 3 options to the client. I'll say, first option, if you're not happy, we just crash, move on to the next property. Next one is, I know I'm actually a chartered structural engineer as well, so which is good. I can look at it, and I've actually got 2 other engineers in my team, and go, look, it looks like it's built to code. Let's send a surveyor over to have a look at the property and just kind of tick off that it actually is, which is actually insurances you can get now once you've got that certificate to say basically it's covered for insurance. Let's try to get some money off the purchase price. Costs around 12 to 14 grand to get a mezzanine approved. Let's get 50, 80 grand off the purchase price and then get it approved ourselves. With that is typically they get knocked back because you don't have adequate car spaces. Because of the extra floor space, they need more people and car spots, and that's why they get back. So we'll talk with a town plan to make sure that's all right. But that's a nice little where it's a win-win. We can get the property at an even better price and make some money. The other one is actually just asking the seller to extend settlement and get them let them approve it as part of settlement conditions. So that way, if they can't, we crash the deal, we move on. But you don't make any money with that one. So I'll just kind of present all 3 options and go from there. And that's a typical one. The
Well, it
other
really comes down to, and it's the same in residential, that it's, it's not always, a deal's not always done on the price, it's done on the terms, isn't it?
the hard thing with commercial, and this is the main difference with residential, is the contracts are subject to due diligence. Whereas residential, you typically do all that up front.
Yeah.
But because there's so much work, like we literally spend 30 to 40 hours per deal on due diligence. We give them a 120-page due diligence report, cross-checking on. So you can't do all that up front. Basically, you're going off what the agent gave you on the information memorandum, and then making your offer based on that. You'll check 3 to 5 comparables for sales and rentals and make sure it's kind of ballpark there. But you basically buy the property assuming everything's going to be wrong with it, and then cross-check it and try to make sure that everything's right with it. And so it's sort of a bit of a different mindset. You do just find stuff that you just don't like as well. You miss something and find there's an easement or there's some new infrastructure going in and they're building multiple warehouses, or if it's retail, they might actually be building like a Woolworths or something like that around the corner, which in your head you're like, oh, that's good. They're building there, but it takes it completely away from the foot traffic of your one. So that'd be one you crash as well. So there's so many more moving parts to actually crash on, whereas residential normally comes down to a building and pest inspection and that's it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's one thing you've proven in all of that is that it's not the sort of thing you want to do on your own, which brings us to two questions I've got for you. The first one is, how does somebody know when commercial is right for them? When is the right time for me to be starting to entertain a commercial property to add to my, I don't think there's too many first-time investors who go direct to commercial. Would that be fair?
Case by case, not normally first time, but normally the age might dictate that. If it's
okay, that's true too. Okay,
if there might be a business owner that all they've got is their principal place of residence and they're quite cashed up in their 50s, you might go down that route.
Okay. But for a typical investor who maybe has 1 or 2 properties, or they've started to max out their residential portfolio, starting to think about time to add a commercial, when do you think is the right time for someone to start to do that? Is there a specific point, or does it come down to their borrowing power? How do you make a decision on that?
Yeah, this is probably the toughest question, where the plan's coming. I might answer it a different way, actually. I might answer it when commercial's not right for you.
Yeah.
So when commercial's not right for you is when you've still got lots of servicing for residential. So i.e. you've got way bigger borrowing capacities for residential.
Yeah.
The other one is it doesn't fit your risk profile. So you're not a student investor that can handle the buffers and the risks of commercial. And then the other one's you're too early on in your portfolio. So you always want to build a nice stable base. So like I bought 9 residential before I bought my first commercial. So they're kind of the reasons. But like I mentioned before, it's going to come down to what you're trying to achieve, what time frame is going to make it. You touched on it as well. Your finances typically dictate a lot of it as well. So if you go to your mortgage broker and they come back and they say, no matter what position you're in, they say, oh, look, because you're at servicing issues, you've got $2 million capacity for commercial, but only 1.2 for residential. What's the argument to go residential? Because I believe that you get the same capital growth and you get 3 times the cash flow. Why would I buy the residential when I get less leverage? So there's that. Normally it's the other way around earlier in your portfolio, because you can get 80, 90% loans. You might have a 2 mil capacity for residential, 1.2 for commercial. Cool. We're leaving kind of lending on the table if we go commercial, you go from there. Sometimes it's the same, and then it becomes a tough question as well. And then other times you won't have lending for both. You'll have to go to like a lease stock loan. Then it's the chats about the highest interest rates on those and whether you want to keep progressing the portfolio. So it's trying to marry up that finance with the what you're trying to achieve. But typical rule of thumb is most people go out and buy 2 or 3 residentials, hit the glass ceiling or get close to their servicing limits for residential, and then they'll transfer into commercial. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they do. And this is when I used to be a residential buyer's agent. They'll do like a high yielding resi strategy. They'll buy their blue chip in quotation marks, which you probably hate that term, but you know what I mean? Residential. Then they'll shift to the housing granny flats or the really regional areas or the multi-tenancy or whatever it may be. So it just, there's no right answer. Everyone's risk profile, circumstances are different. And that's why you use buyer's agents and you talk to property strategists.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. So, even if you do use a buyer's agent for residential or commercial, it's always wise to know what you're looking for and have an understanding of it, before you even engage the agent. And, something you've done in the past is produce a couple of books. You've done one on residential and property investment, Oh, there you go. And one on commercial. And anybody who's interested in getting one of Steve's books or both, if you go to paliseproperty.com.au, there's a section on there. You put in the hotspotting code, you'll be able to get both of those books for free. You just got to pay for the postage and handling. And if that wasn't enough, you've gone and spent, I know it was a pretty big dollar figure that it's cost you to build this, but also a lot of time and effort into recording a commercial property course as well. The Commercial Property Institute. I'll put a link on here for people shortly. But tell us a bit about the course itself and why you decided to spend the time and money on building a commercial property course.
Yeah, so I did the book, and the book I actually wrote because there was no information out there. I was the first commercial book on the market.
Yeah, I've got to say, I personally bought one and read it over Christmas a year or two ago. It's a brilliant read.
Yeah, so I did that. The whole purpose of the course was you can only kind of fit so much in a book in regards to the how-tos. Like I can show you how it works and things like that, but you can't go through about like how to search for properties, how to actually do the due diligence, where to get the information from. It doesn't really have you can't really do a walkthrough in that. So I spent the last year building that. Literally took over a year and 14 months total to kind of get it out, and then about 50 hours of filming. Then my social media team told me people don't want to watch it for 50 hours, Steve, so we compressed that down into 10 hours. But yeah, it's just an easier way where people can actually like see a live property and how to do the due diligence on it and what steps and where to get the information from and how to search and find information. So it's basically everything the book has, plus like an extra 30-40% of the walkthroughs, due diligence, how to use the spreadsheets as well. There's about 5 or 6 cash flow, return on investment, stress test calculators, all that type of stuff. You can't explain how to use a spreadsheet in a book. So it's me, my ugly mug in the corner, going through, showing you actually how to use the spreadsheets and all that type of stuff. So you don't have to use a buyer's agent after this. You can do the course and you'll understand 95% of kind of what you need to do. Part of the buyer's agent itself, myself, is I'll save you hundreds of hours looking for properties because I've got better contacts, 5 staff looking for you in particular. But there's no secrets. Everything I use is on there. You can download it and use it, and basically get from there.
Amazing. And how much is the course?
Course is normally what, 4,997, but hotspotting, put in the code to get it for free.
Amazing. Now this won't stick around for very long for people to get it for free. So I do say if you want to take advantage of Steve's offer now, I believe once you sign in for it as well, you've got it forever.
Got it forever, lifetime access. You can
lifetime access. So yeah, it's an amazing. Amazing. I must admit, I've been in there and started the course myself, and it's incredible content. You've done a really good job. It's a high spec course where no expense has been spared.
One of the cool things I found out a couple of days ago, so it actually, for the real estate professionals, it now counts to your CPD hours. So there's 12 hours there you can actually go through. You got to do the quizzes and get the certificate at the end, but it'll count to your CPD hours.
Amazing. All right. Well, let's take it to some questions. We've had quite a few questions coming in already, but please, anybody who has any questions for Steve, let's take advantage. We've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. Steve, one of the first questions I have here was from Steve for Steve. Is are there any particular areas in Australia that you're focusing on at the moment? Probably comes down to budgets and things like that, I assume.
Yeah, so I've bought in every capital city and every regional town, and it's always case by case. If you ask me in terms of where I'm mainly buying Brisbane, Sydney, and Perth at the moment. Main reason for that is getting really good bang for buck. Like you start talking 5.5 to 6.5% net yields, whereas if you go like a Melbourne, Adelaide, or Canberra, you start going sub 5%. So really good bang for buck there. But again, it's case by case. It depends on what your budget is. Certain areas, if they want some hot spots, pun intended, certain areas that are really, really tight are actually like the areas that are well encapsulated by like water. So like Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, some have some of the tightest vacancy rates for retail and industrial in Australia. And then, like I mentioned, certain kind of regional towns do as well. But it's the biggest driver is going to be your budget. So like if you've got sub 2 mil budget, you probably get best bang for buck in Brisbane and Perth. If you've got 3 to 5 mil budgets, then looking in the Sydney, Adelaide, and Canberra, you get some really good value because you get out of like the typical mum and dad kind of price points. Then it also depends on what you want. Like, so we're personally going under contract on a few Hungry Jacks around Australia in capital cities, and we're getting 6% net yields on brand new Hungry Jacks with
And are
seven.
you talking just in the way of owning the real estate or the business as well, or mixture?
So owning the property and the land.
And
So
okay.
the business will be the tenant. So like the major like fast food chains will be the tenant that pay
Yeah.
you. They've got negatives as well, which I might say for the next podcast as well, because
Yeah.
when you get to lease renewals, guess who's got the power? So when you're talking about rental increase, if you get a big major chain like a Bunnings or a fast food, and they say, no, we're not signing the next lease unless you give us this rent, there's all of a sudden a bit of a power shift. Whereas
bully you a bit.
Yeah, so there's that part of it as well. But you also know that you're going to have perfect rent for the next 7-10 years or however long the lease is as well. But yeah, that's probably my main little one is find a well encapsulated area that's either landlocked or locked by water. And then that's a good indicator for growth as well. So like one of the ones we bought recently, Tweed Heads, like vacancy rates are basically stuff all because there's no stock and they just keep building up around it.
Yeah. Very good. Next one is from Lisa. She says, I've got roughly 500,000 in a self-managed super fund. Would you recommend commercial for a self-managed super fund? You got to come down.
So yeah, we buy lots for self-managed super fund. I don't try not to give financial advice because not my job. My job's going to be, if I'm buying for a self-managed super fund, I try to get a lower risk commercial because you can't do big value add projects on it. I'd get a tick the box one.
It's worth noting when you're under self-managed super fund, if there is a loan, a non-recourse loan, you can't make improvements to the property the same as when you're in a residential. So that takes away the value add until you've paid off the debt.
Yeah. You can't revalue the property anyway to get another loan. So there's certain rules like that. But in regards to like when you compare, I'll answer it this way: if you compare it to residential, for me personally, it makes more sense buying a commercial because I want a passive income for my retirement. So why don't I get 2 to 3 times the income that way? There's also big tax advantages as well. So obviously you're doing additional contributions and things like that, and the tax incentives. So normally, what would kind of get you buying a personal name commercial? Like obviously a positive gear. If you pay for commercial, it's 100 grand positive gear, you're paying tax on that. Whereas self-managed super funds, you actually get away. That's part of the benefits of self-managed super funds. So for me personally, I think they're actually a way better outcome than a residential. But again, like we've spoken about for the last 40 minutes, comes down to risk profile, how stable your job is, if you're doing extra contributions, are you a business owner, how much you've got to spend. But 500,000 will get you a very quality 1.5 mil industrial property or a really good retail showroom retail somewhere. So there's definitely options there. Have a chat with your broker, have a chat with your buyer's agent, have a chat with your financial advisor, and then make a decision from there.
Yeah, as you said, it's worthwhile having a broker who specialises in commercial too. Yeah,
and self-managed super funds.
Yeah, true. One from Jenny. She says, thanks, Steve. Really enjoyed the presentation. Good on you, Jenny. She's asking, what do you think the future of retail looks like here in Australia?
I actually just did a really long form video on this on YouTube, about a 15-minute kind of breakthrough. I actually think the suburban retails are the ones moving forward. People don't go to the city. I live on the northern beaches. I do not go to major shopping centers anymore. I walk down to the local IGA, get my hair cut at the same kind of spot. Actually, I know I look terrible right now. I probably need one. You go to literally your little shops there. So they're the ones moving forward, especially as we get more and more technology increases. So this is going to sound a bit airy and fairy, but there's going to be less and less demand for people to be in person. And I know some of the old school guys say, oh, look, Steve, there's nothing like seeing someone in person. That's bridges gapped massively. Like people used to say that to me prior to, like when I used to be an engineer and work on an actual PC tower, like the thought of having a laptop you could move around, then all of a sudden you'd work at site. Then you could work remotely. Like the line always moves. Like you can, I saw on Apple Vision goggles, you can put it on now and you can have Gordon Ramsay telling you when to turn your steak. So that gap is coming, and people have a very short-term memory. Like 15 years ago, there wasn't even an iPhone. So I think there's going to be less of a need to go to the big major cities unless it's for an experience. So I actually predicting that's actually be one of the biggest growers moving forward. It's going to get the most demand there. Again, external factors, the economy and recessions and all that stuff still has a part of it. But I personally just bought a little shopping center.
There you go. You heard it here first. Question from Andrew. If I want to buy commercial in a self-managed super fund, is there a minimum I should have in order to buy quality commercial rather than just anything?
Yeah, so there's actually rules about the minimum you're allowed anyway to buy property, because there's liquidity rules and that. General rule of thumb is about 200K. That's the official rule for self-managed super funds. For commercial, for a self-managed super fund, I'd like to buy the purchase price of more than $1 million. You can buy little $500,000 ones, but the main
As
issue
you
with
say, you got
those,
to hold it for a long time. The strategy is a bit different.
yeah, for me, again, this is just my personal opinion. A self-managed super fund should be headache-free. Whereas if you go and buy like a little $300,000 or $500,000 like industrial property, you're not getting a big tenant on a long lease. It's going to be average Joe's electrical services, and it's a 1-2 man band. They're going to come and go every 2-3 years, and you have to get a new tenant. I'd say leave that stuff outside your self-managed super fund and use it as a kind of nest egg. But again, try not to give financial advice here. General thumb, $1 million plus, you start moving into really quality ones. But I've personally got multiple properties under 500,000 as well, so you can still do well. My first commercial, literally just set and forget, bought it 400,000, now worth 800,000 7 years later. So like you can still do well out of the cheap ones.
Yeah, no, love it. One from Chris. Thanks, Tim and Steve. Looking at leaving the workplace, we are in our 60s, selling 4 residential, reducing debt, move into commercial in about 2 years' time via self-managed super fund, looking at about 8 to 9% net all up, say 125K passive, presumably no loans and mix it up, maybe a block of units. Any thoughts or suggestions? Thanks.
So is he asking how to get an 8 or 9% return, or is he asking should he shift into commercial? And
I think he's asking, do those numbers sort of seem right, and does that strategy seem good from your perspective?
So read the question. He had four residential properties.
Yeah, in their 60s. 4 residential, reducing debt and move into commercial in about 2 years via the self-managed super fund. Looking at an 8 or 9% net, all up, say 125K passive, presumably no loans and mix it up, maybe a block of units. You probably, I suppose. Probably
the units you got to be careful of. So the yields that always people present on those, like, so even if you get like a 7% gross yield on that, by the time you pay all the council rates and water rates and that'll probably reduce to around a 4% maximum, absolute maximum. What people don't take into account those is most units have way more wear and tear, and because
you're liable for that as opposed to a normal commercial.
And then there's common area as well, and then there's also just multiple everything, multiple kitchens, bathrooms, washing machines, dishwashers, all that type of. So the maintenance can kind of kill you a little bit there. But to answer it with the commercial answer, to get around 125K income unencumbered, you need about 2 mil worth of commercial. That's 2 mil on 6.25% net yields. You're at the 125K income. So if you can get around 2 mil cash, you can get that instantly with commercial. The benefit, obviously, with property, as opposed to putting in like shares or something like that, is you get the continued capital growth as well. So if the property grows at 6%, that 6% return actually ends up being like an 18% ROI.
Yeah. No, very good. All right. Well, that's about all the time we've got for today. So once again, Steve, thank you so much. You're always really, your time I know is valuable, but you're always very generous with your time and share a lot of your secret sauce. There's a lot of people who like to hide that behind a lock and key. You not only want to talk about it, you go and create a course and give it all away for free. And I assure you guys, if you're interested at all in commercial property, do yourself a favor, jump on commercialpropertyinstitute.com.au. Use the hotspotting code and take advantage of it. It's a huge saving, and you get it for life. So Steve, thank you so much. Let's do it again soon.
Awesome, Tim. Thank you very much.
Good on you guys. Chat soon. Bye.